and welcome to this episode of Death is for the Dying. I'm your host, Rebecca Richmond. After a person dies, the first thing that their family will have to decide is what to do with the body. If you go to most funeral homes, there are going to be only two options that'll be presented to you. It's either cremation or it's embalming and burial. In cremation, the body will be placed in a closed furnace where it is burned at temperatures of 1600 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for about 90 minutes. Once the body is burned, the remaining bones are ground into a powder and returned to the family as ashes. Embalming involves draining the body of blood and other fluids and replacing them with a mix of preservatives such as formaldehyde, methanol, and sodium nitrate. This will slow decomposition and allow for a lifelike corpse at a viewing, but the body will still eventually decay. However, the funeral industry is changing, and families have new options available to them, at least if they live in some specific states. To find out more about these options, we talked with Seth Viddal, the co-owner of the Natural Funeral in Colorado. But to understand why Seth is so passionate about providing as many options as possible, you first have to understand why he got into the funeral industry.
I had the privilege of being raised by a single mother who was really devoted to me and my younger brother. And when I was 10 years old, I was adopted by the man who'd be my stepfather, Raymond Olachia, who was a Mescalero Apache. And he immediately not only became a father figure in my life, but introduced me to an appreciation and connection with nature that's been a lifelong inspiration to me. I mean, he literally taught me which trail to walk on and which berries were safe to eat and a lot of natural techniques and a real joy for understanding my place in the cycle of life. My father I'm going to fast forward quite a bit in the story. My father would die in about 10 years ago. And we went to the same funeral home that had served my grandparents. And we basically bought him the same funeral service that we had purchased for my grandparents about a decade before. In hindsight, the service didn't really match who he was. We kind of did the same thing that we had done for my grandparents. About a year later, I had a younger brother who died. He died by suicide. His name was Sam. I found myself sitting across the desk from the same funeral director with a grief-stricken mother, and we basically facilitated the exact same funeral we'd had for Dad about a year before and the same funeral we'd had for grandparents about 10 years before. And again, it didn't really connect with who Sam was. And then exactly a year later, my mother would die suddenly and unexpectedly. And I found myself sitting across the same desk in the same small town from the same funeral director, and we bought the same funeral, the same visitation and viewing, and it really was a cookie cutter for people whose lives were absolutely not replicas of each other. They were really different people. During that time, I owned a construction company. And it was very successful. It still is successful to this day. I woke up in a state of disbelief, and I expressed to my wife at the time, I can't believe that, one, we just spent so much money having these funeral services that didn't really map to the lives of my father or mother or my little brother, but that there didn't seem to be any other alternatives out there. So we sold our business, and I went back to school in my 40s with a devotion to finding a path that would serve people who were having an end-of-life transition in a very meaningful way. And I didn't know what that was going to look like at the time. through connecting with people. I started volunteering in hospice organizations, and I started taking contemplative training classes about sitting with people at the bedside while they're dying, and started reading books voraciously about how can a funeral service intersect with someone's life in a way that matches their values. As I graduated and wrapped up that study, that would have been back in 2019, I got connected with some folks in Boulder County whose ambition was to open up an ecological funeral home. So the name was decided on, and an address had been picked, but the doors weren't open yet. I joined forces with the founders of the Natural Funeral, and within a couple of months of working together, was offered a partnership in the firm. And so I got into the Natural Funeral in direct response to the questions I was asking myself about how we could make a difference at this moment in people's lives when they're particularly vulnerable, when perhaps a lot of folks haven't made a plan ahead of time about how their lives would be honored. Yeah, that was kind of my entry point into funeral service. There were over 22,000 funeral homes in the United States, and that the vast majority of them were doing the same thing as everyone else, and that there was such a limited perspective about what might be meaningful to a family at the end of life. Generally, when you walk into a conventional funeral home today, you're presented with two choices. Would you like cremation or burial? And are we going to have a viewing or not? There are some other tangential things that might come into that conversation, but at its most basic level, those are the things that a funeral service is offering to a family. And there tends to be a lot of upselling and cajoling and influence around what the funeral director's expectation that a family is going to connect with. And that was surprising to me that there weren't more voices that were radically divergent out of such an enormous business segment, a greater than $20 billion a year business segment.
So as the first step to avoid ending up having a generic funeral service, Seth suggests you have to figure out first what you value in life.
It's to describe the things that are the most important to you in living, because there's not really any reason that I've watched people's values change at their time of death. So, for example, if you want a big church service with clergy and deacons and hearses and limos, and you should put a plan in place for that. If you've been a member of a church and have a role there in your community, then those are the people who are going to want to celebrate your life. If you're more secular and you have a club or an association, a school group, any meaningful section of your community, would encourage folks to honor their own needs and to not really be swayed externally. Another example would be someone who had a really environmental passion in living. Maybe they drove an electric car. Maybe they had solar panels on their house, or they zero-escaped their yard. Well, as they're checking in with themselves about their values, someone like that is going to have a real conflict with burial that's in a cemetery that has, you say, grass that's perpetually watered and mowed, when they might have zero-escaped their yard, before they died. Someone who composted their kitchen scraps because they saw their place in the cycle of life might be opposed to filling their body with toxic chemicals that are designed to preserve a corpse for some amount of time, but have a horrific impact on the environment and on the people who treat their body with those chemicals. So we get a lot of joy from talking with people about what is possible. And at the Natural Funeral, not only do we emphasize what's possible to the ecological consumer, we emphasize what's possible when you check in with your own humanity and decide that Maybe an outdoor open pyre cremation on private property is what resonates with me. Well, I can share with you that's not ecological. That's not an environmentally friendly practice, but it's something that we would move heaven and earth to enable for family. And we do enable that for families. Not that it's environmental, but because it's what's important to that family at this time. It's something that can shift the needle on their relationship with their finite life or their relationship with their family. So I would encourage people to not be limited in belief just because they haven't seen a particular funeral be carried out that way. And my prayer to the funeral community, the commercial providers of funeral services, is that they won't be limited just by things that they've seen before or what's important to them. If a church service is important to me, it may not be important to you.
The second step is to know all your options, starting with alkaline hydrolysis, otherwise known as aquamation or water cremation.
It uses an alkaline solution of chemical compounds mixed with water to gently remove the soft tissue of the body or otherwise reduce the body. And so at the conclusion of a water cremation process, which is similar in time to a flame cremation process, it's just a few hours long, the body has been reduced, but not converted into smoke, as is what happens in a flame cremation, but instead the body is converted into a liquid form. That liquid is sterile, it's DNA-free, pathogen-free, it's only measurable at an elemental level. So I can detect nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and calcium and magnesium, but I can't detect some pharmaceutical. I can't detect the DNA that was this person's body. And because of that, because it's neutral and sterile and filled with elements, it is a nutrient-rich biostimulant that can be given back to the earth. So rather than our bodies being converted by a chemical reaction with flame and into gas or smoke, our bodies are converted by a chemical reaction with alkaline compounds and converted into a nutrient-rich liquid. The family does still get back what we would think of as ash or cremated remains in an urn, because the body is still contains skeletal remains following the alkaline hydrolysis process. We take those remains, we produce a powder out of them, which is very similar to a flame cremation process where the skeletal remain is reduced into a powder. And then the families are offered that back in an urn. And then the third sort of byproduct of alkaline hydrolysis is that anything that's been implanted in the body medically, be it titanium or silicone or a pacemaker or any prosthetic that's in the body, is sent for medical recycling. So rather than a titanium hip being melted into something that's not recoverable, we take that intact and would send it out to a medical recycler. So that's water cremation in a nutshell. And terramation is a process that's legally, it's called natural organic reduction. And as opposed to flame cremation or water cremation, which are chemical reactions, processes of chemistry, natural organic reduction is a process of biology. So it is a living conversion of the body into what we call regenerative living soil. So you could think of it as composting. The body in our terramation process is placed into a vessel that we call the chrysalis. The chrysalis is a vessel where we can control the moisture level, the airflow, and regulate temperature. And those are our main levers in this natural process of biology. The body is placed in the chrysalis surrounded by wood chips, straw, and alfalfa. We add a very specially brewed biological tea, which contains some bacteria and fungi which are going to aid the body's own ecosystem of bacteria that we carry in our GI. And over about 3 to 4 months, this living process of biology, along with the wood chips, straw, and alfalfa, and the body all become soil. We manage, like I said, the temperature and the moisture. So we rotate the vessel as needed, and we oxygenate the vessel, controlling air input and exhaust.
Of the two options, water cremation and terramation, there is one clear winner.
The trajectory towards terramation will eclipse the public's uptake and acceptance at a faster pace than water cremation. And I can say that actually empirically, because that's what I see happening at our funeral home. So water cremation became legal in Colorado back in 2011, and no one implemented it. It became legal and no one offered it. And it wasn't until 2019 that, one, the Natural Funeral was formed, and two, that we began offering that in the state for the first time. And since 2019, we've served hundreds and hundreds of families. We've served them not only through the front doors of the Natural Funeral, but we offer our services as a trade partnership to other funeral homes. So we serve the customers of other partner mortuaries around Colorado and allow them to offer these technologies without having had to make the initial capital investment in setting up these offerings. Well, back in around 2020, when we were offering testimony to the Colorado Energy and Environment Subcommittee in support of natural organic reduction, or terramation, we had no idea that how popular that would be. And so in just 2 short years, terramation has actually become the highest volume choice that we have here at the Natural Funeral. And that's between burial, green burial, flame cremation, water cremation, terramation, private land burials, private land funeral pyres. Terramation just sort of shot to the top of the list. And I say that, and Marco, what's really interesting is it's by a factor of 2 the most expensive thing that we offer.
Really?
And yes, and so terramation is an extremely labor-intensive process. Yeah. And so a flame cremation, is literally a flip of a switch. And a water cremation is a little bit more than that. There's a gentle placement of the body in the vessel, but it's a rather instantaneous process. A couple of hours in our instrument, and then a couple of hours of post-processing while we're sending out medical devices for recycling, and we're separating those bone or ash remains that'll go back to the family in the urn. It's a rather low labor process. Whereas terramation is 3 to 4 months of managed supervision over this biological process, where every single day, well, Monday through Friday, our team is interacting with each chrysalis vessel. So because of that, it's just a more expensive process because it's much less automated, and it's still the fastest growing segment of our business.
I can say, sort of on the anecdotal side, I was like trying to get my sister to like consider aquamation for my mom, who's currently in a care home. And she was like, no, that's disgusting. There seems to be an ick factor with aquamation that is a little bit hard to get around.
I agree. I don't disagree. In fact, my own plans were for green burial for myself. And then when we began offering water cremation in August of 2019, I changed that to be my plan. And then when we began offering terramation in September of 2021, I changed that to be my plan. So I've certainly evolved that direction. Legislatively, 28 states have laws allowing alkaline hydrolysis. And even though there are 28 states that have those laws in place, there are not that many operators who are doing this. So a lot of states, it's allowable, but funeral homes aren't running with the technology. By contrast, terramation has only been a around in the sort of public domain for a few years. And already 8 states have legalized terramation. And there are about 9 additional states that are considering legislation this year. The uptake, the public's uptake on this process has been phenomenal and unlike anything the funeral industry has ever seen. And I think, Rebecca, it speaks to maybe it is an ick factor where someone could look at the byproduct of water cremation and say, yeah, I see how that could be a biostimulant and help plants as a fertilizer. Or they can look at hundreds of pounds of beautiful, rich earth and say, there's no question in my mind how that reintegrates with the cycle of life. This other one over here, I have to make a little logical leap and think about agricultural fertilization. This other one over here, I'm looking at the most beautiful garden soil I've ever seen in my life, and I can't wait to plant something in that. So it really is maybe a perception thing.
I think also, and I'd have to look into the state laws in this, but what I've heard is that, like, at least in Washington, the liquid just goes down the drain. It's not actually used for fertilization.
There are a lot of places, I would say the vast majority of funeral homes who offer alkaline hydrolysis. That is in fact true. We made a really deliberate decision at the Natural Funeral that we would only use a system where we could capture the liquid essence of each body. So we ensure that that does not happen for our funeral customers or for any of our funeral home partners that we serve. We capture the liquid essence and we offer it alongside the cremated remains, the bone remains, and the urn to the family. Most families will take a small token amount of a few ounces, and a beautiful way that families celebrate that is by putting a few drops in their watering bucket before they go around to their house plants. So yes, Rebecca, that does happen sometimes. I would argue that the environmental benefits would still remain, even in firms that are doing that, because there's such a low energy consumption and it's a closed loop system. So there's no pollution. And even the water that would be returned to drain would be upcycled, through our network of water, treatment that we are fortunate to have. So it wouldn't be a wasteful per se, but it's not the way we chose to do it here.
Yeah. No, I mean, I personally am like, yeah, sure. Flush my water down the drain. I'm cool. But I can see the resistance there if that's the case.
Yeah. This feels like an appropriate time to suggest, if that leaves you with a little bit of resistance, the thought of the essence of your body being sent down a drain, you should look up what happens to bodily fluids during embalming, because it's what the other 22,000 funeral homes are offering. And I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. The drain is involved.
I would 100% choose water cremation over embalming. I've seen videos about what happens in embalming. Would prefer not. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for your support.
So we talked about water cremation and terra cremation. You said there were some other options?
Yeah. So, well, along the lines of flame cremation, it's a really meaningful moment to some people for religious reasons or for personal reasons to have a cremation that is not indoors and that actually frees the spirit of the body to connect with the air of the earth. And we offer that service through a private land cremation pyre service. And it's just a magnificently beautiful expression of a life returning to the spirit. Another sort of off the menu at most funeral homes option would be private land burial. And this is a really sweet way to intersect with families in what may be the most historically connecting funeral choice to our ancestors dating, thousands of years. which would be a burial in a very natural way, generally only a cotton shroud, where we dig a hole on private property. And of course, we coordinate with the local coroner and sheriff and the county to register through a burial affidavit the location of each body that we place. The body is placed in its most natural way, in its most natural surroundings, generally close to where the person lived and died. And we've been doing that as humans for tens of thousands of years. And so that's a really special way that we work with families who generally they have, an agricultural parcel or some acreage, although we have been able to conduct these in pretty close city proximities.
I asked Seth what he wished people knew about the funeral industry.
I wish that people understood that even though a funeral has become commodified, a funeral is something that a business trades service for dollars, that the vast majority of funeral home workers, from the embalmers to the cremationists to the funeral directors to the arrangers to even the people in advertising, are generally some of the finest humans I've ever met, who choose to have hours that extend into the wee hours of the night, who are generally committed to finding a way to ease a family's transition through what's sometimes the very worst day in people's lives. Simultaneously, I wish they knew that they have a lot of power and they have a lot of choice in what is possible. I wish that folks knew that planning ahead could save them some difficult choices at a really intense moment when they might not be best equipped to make big decisions. I wish that folks would bring into the conversation these topics, even if it's just a conversation about our mortality. Not necessarily what are you going to do with your body, but isn't it a fine day and aren't we lucky to be here? And 100 years from now, neither one of us is going to be here. And maybe a year from now, neither one of us is going to be here, or one of us isn't going to be here. And that people would just add value to today, knowing that we all have this date with destiny and that we can arrive at that date prepared and filled with an appreciation for a life well spent, or we can kind of keep that conversation in the corner and meet it when we get there.
I've definitely had my professor for my PhD when I was trying to get a PhD. He died suddenly. And it was funny because I was studying bioarchaeology, so human remains. And then it was funny to realize this man who had worked with death had no will, no preparation. And he had like several heart attacks before this. And it was chaos for his wife. It was so stressful. So yeah, that whole take the time to think about it now, because it's the best gift you can give somebody later, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really is time well spent, even if the time is somber, even if it's not humorous. And it's just a real deep dive into what matters to us the most. It is time well spent.
And if you have more questions about this, Seth has an invitation.
If you're curious about how to have the conversation, we'd love to talk with you. If you're curious about some of the technology we spoke about, we'd love to share that with folks. If you're curious about demystifying what's going to happen to your own body when you're through using it, I'd just like to extend a connecting point. It doesn't matter where you are. We're in Colorado. We have plans for a larger expansion. There's a calling for what we're delivering to happen on a much larger national basis. But that conversation can start today. And if we can be an entry point that makes that an easier access for people, we'd love to do that.
We will include links to the Natural Funeral in the episode description, so feel free to reach out. In our next episode, we will talk more about the ritual side of death, including why rituals are important and what rituals you can practice even if you aren't religious. Until that time, take care. And you can join the conversation by reaching out on Twitter and Instagram to @lifeisfortheL or emailing us at lifeisforthelivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also watch these episodes and the epitaphs on our new YouTube channel, so check it out.